Research has consistently indicated that the top issue for students, whether they're complaining about a course or whether they're praising a course, is the idea of relevance. Normally you would define relevance at this point, but actually we're going to define it as we go along because we're going to explore some of the dimensions of relevance and how that applies to us. So I won't do that at this point. We'll build that definition as we go along. So here's the problem. Most faculty that I work with say, well, everything I teach is relevant. I mean, I wouldn't be teaching it if it wasn't relevant, right? Well, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is not real relevance, right? It's the perception of relevance primarily on the part of the students. Now, we could throw our hands up in the air, but what I've observed over the years is very often we assume, because we know how relevant things are, we assume that students can figure that out as well. And we rarely take the time, or sometimes rarely even put in the thought of actually why is this relevant and explaining its relevance to students. So we rarely make the case of relevance, and students are left to figure it out on their own, and the sad fact is that most of the time they can't. They have a hard time. Now, some of you are lucky. You work in departments where you don't teach general education courses, and so you have majors that are in your departments, and they've already kind of figured out why they want to be there. But this is certainly more applicable if you're teaching general education courses. So the question that we have that we'll try to answer today is, how do we as instructors make the case for relevance? How do we help students perceive that? Okay, well, we're going to have a few shifts of thinking as we go along. Okay, so let me just ask, let's see. Brock, what do you teach?
I teach neuroscience classes.
Neuroscience classes. Paul, what do you teach?
School psychology.
School psychology? Okay, Taylor, I won't ask you. Jeff, what do you teach?
Intro and history of psychology.
Intro and history of psychology. Okay. So notice that what everybody just said was they teach a subject. But the first thing we probably need to shift is not that we teach a subject, but that we're teaching people. Now, this might not seem like a big shift, but when you start to think about the implications of it, it actually does change what you do and how you approach it and what you think about. If you think you're teaching a subject, you'll get your subject all organized nice, and you'll get your PowerPoints and everything like that, and you'll think everything is just wonderful. And based on the subject matter, it probably is. But that doesn't mean that the people you are teaching it to are really going to be able to make sense of what you've got for them. And so you have to stop and think, I'm teaching people. People come with their own experiences, their own background, their own strengths and weaknesses. And as I'm thinking about teaching, I need to think about those things. Those things are just as important, if not maybe more important, than how does the subject hang together. So that's the first shift. And so let's talk about people and how we learn. First of all, we learn by experience. Starting off from when we're very young, we have experiences that teach us. So we learn by experience. Philosophers for a long time also, as well as educational philosophers, we learn by experience. But what do we actually do? Let me kick that one there. As we are experiencing the world, we create this mental model of reality. It's not 100% reality, it's our version of reality. Some people, you've probably heard the word schema, that we have this schema. It's not a complete representation of the world. It still can be somewhat fragmented. There are some other terms there, but essentially they all mean the same thing. That we construct this model of the world in our mind, and then we actually start acting in the world, and as we're doing that, we're testing this model and we're revising this model kind of as we go along. It's almost like the advertisement. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It was a few years ago, Super Bowl advertisement where these guys are building a plane as it flies, right? They're up in the air building this plane. Well, that's almost kind of sort of what we're doing, is we're building our model as we go along and revising it. So we come with this, we don't come as a blank slate. When we come to class, we're not a blank slate. We have all these experiences. We have this mental model that we've created. That mental model might be more or less accurate. So, as we learn from this direct experience that we have, this real experience, we start making these conceptual ideas about our experience. Now, as long as we're the ones doing it, we know how we're tying our concepts to our direct experience. Okay? But when we go to somebody else who has a different concept than we do, we don't always know how to bridge this gap. We can't always connect that concept to our direct experience. And what happens a lot of time, I'm going to use the laser pointer, then I don't have to kill my eyes. What happens, especially in higher education, is we spend a lot of time out here in this conceptual area, right? And 30 years of research has shown that students can kind of operate out here, and they can actually pass the tests, and they can get A's, but they leave the classroom and they still can't connect what they've learned to their own experience, to how it works in the real world. And so we have this gap. It's like a synapse that is too large. The connections just don't get made. So one of the ways that we can deal with relevance is to provide some of these connections back to direct experience. Now, the one downside of direct experience is it's very inefficient. That's why we like this out here. The conceptual experience out here is very efficient. This can be costly and it can be very inefficient, but that means we can use some of these other ideas here. So we have simulated experience. So we create something that's very much like the real thing, but it's not quite in some respects. Usually safety is an issue. We make it safe so they don't kill themselves, right? Like a flight simulator. It's like the real thing, and they get to experience it, but it's not quite the real thing. Then we can also use this idea of a vicarious experience, that we can learn from the experience of others. And stories, actually, are one good form of vicarious experience. And that's the other side here is, in order to generate a rich conceptual experience, you usually have to have quite a bit of direct experience, right? And that takes time. So we need to have a way to speed up the process, and these things can actually help us have more experience much more efficiently than having the direct experience. I'm actually not even saying, you'll hear some people say that lectures are a bad thing. And I'm not even saying that, okay? All of these experiences are valid experiences. Let me move on and I'll explain a little bit more. You can also see that both of these things, that this is kind of a continuum going from a concrete to abstract experience. It also turns out that novices need things more down in this area than experts do, right? And when you think about it, if you get a room full of experts and they're talking, this conceptual experience for them is probably more rich in many ways than a direct experience, because this can explain so many more things to them than a single experience can. And so all of these experiences are valid. What you need to look at, again, this is getting back to your students. Where are your students at? Are they novices? Are they getting close to being experts? They can handle different things at different stages of their development. So, kind of the first order of relevance then that we look at is when we see how something fits into our model, or when we can see how it makes our model of the world better, then we perceive it as being relevant. If we can't fit it somewhere into our construction, then it's like a spare part out there that we don't know what to do with. And we might, it's like me. I have a junk drawer, right? With all the parts in there that came from somewhere. Maybe my kids pulled them out or unscrewed something, and I'm thinking, well, I might need this someday. I better keep it around just until I find out I don't use it. So that's kind of what, if we can't fit it into our mental model, we might have this little junk drawer kind of thing where we keep stuff that, well, I might use it someday, but I don't know how or when. Whoops. Okay, so for the next couple of minutes, if you would think about something you're teaching, a topic or a concept, something you're teaching, and now start asking yourselves these questions, and maybe you can write it down if you brought note paper. How does this topic relate to what students already know? What are some examples of this in the real world that they can relate to, that they can understand? What are the common mistakes and misconceptions that students have? And then what are the consequences of those mistakes or misconceptions? So take a couple of minutes and do that. Yeah, usefulness is the first, that's kind of the first thing that seems to come to mind often, right? The idea that's in my title, how does this apply? Application, right? How am I going to use this? That seems to be kind of the first thing that pops into mind. But I want us to start thinking now that the idea of relevance is a question not of utility or usefulness, but a question of value. In your case, personal meaning, right? You value something. It means something to you. And also of values. We also have a value system, and what we're learning fits into, and this value system can be very idiosyncratic, right? And what we're learning also fits into, or doesn't fit into, our value system. And so we have that issue to deal with as well. So, have you ever heard this question, or maybe even said it yourself? Why do I have to take this course? I'm never going to use it, right? Implicit in that question is this idea of future value. Okay? So, even what I would say is utility or usefulness is a value that we have. It's one of the values, and it may be an important one, so I don't dismiss it. But let's broaden our vision a little bit and think of relevance as pertaining to the value that it brings to the student. It may be usefulness, but it may be something else. Okay, so that kind of, again, talking about people, that kind of brings us to this question, well, why do we learn? And we learn in order to shape the future, okay? Now, that might be kind of a new idea. So if you'll give me a little chance, I'll try and flesh that out for you. We're pretty familiar with the idea of feedback systems, but there's an idea of feed-forward systems as well. And so now this relates to the title, Relevance and Feed-Forward, right? The feed-forward nature of learning. If you look in systems theory and artificial intelligence research, you find out feedback systems react and their model is fixed. They don't learn. They can't change. They just do what they do. When an error occurs, they do what they do to fix it. Especially now in artificial intelligence, they're looking at feed-forward systems. And feed-forward systems are anticipatory. They're trying to look forward instead of look back. And they can also learn or adapt. And the interesting thing here, I think, is the purpose of learning is to improve the future as they're looking at artificial intelligence, to better, so that I can act better in the moment in order to bring about or influence a desired future outcome. So I know what to do now to make something else happen. okay? And I'd love to really go into this in depth, but we'll just kind of skim through real quick. As we look even at humans, human psychology, this idea of feed forward is starting to take hold there as well too. We live in order to face the next moment until the end. We're adapted to facing the uncertainty of the immediate future. And then, by the way, I like George Kelly's. George Kelly does not, his theory is not necessarily a learning theory, but it fits very well. And anybody who wants a little further light reading, look up George Kelly and the Psychology of Personal Constructs. But basically, he's kind of telling us, again, what we've talked about. We have this model of the world. We're acting in the world. This model serves to predict what will happen when we do something. And so we go about in the world doing those things based on those predictions. And when that breaks down, when our model breaks down, then we have a basis for revising our model of the world. We now know that our model doesn't work. We've got to do something about it. But it's looking again at, I want to be able to handle this situation in the future when it arises. What can I do so that I can do that, right? It's not really, we use the past so that we can better anticipate the future. Okay. So, we'll appeal to this, take another couple of minutes here, and we'll appeal to this utilitarian value first, and think about what use is what you're teaching to students in the immediate future, the foreseeable future, still a little bit out there, and perhaps in the distant future. You can also probably guess that most of the time we like things to be relevant for the closer the better, right? The more immediate the better. So you might think about that as well too. But then also think about what other value might this topic have beyond just utilitarian. What personal meaning or what social value or what spiritual value even might this have for students? And then think about what their value system, they come in with a value system. Where does this fit? You might find that if you've got someone like a lot of students come in and their value system is, I need to get a career, you might find that that value system either supports or hinders your teaching. And then and so you might have to deal with that value system. Okay, so this takes us to our third and final shift in thinking here. This is one that's kind of, to me, it's a subconscious assumption or an unspoken assumption that we have in our schools that basically, so I won't ask you, I'll just leap in, that we avoid failure. We teach students to avoid failure. Failure is the enemy. And yet the fact of the matter is, as we've discussed, that failure is what signals to us that we have something to learn. Failure is what makes us ready to learn. So the third shift actually is to let students fail. But then also, just to make sure that we don't get to the end of the semester and you say, I've done my job because I failed all my students. You also give them opportunities to recover, right? But it's that failure that signals to them that something's not working in their model. So again, we'll skip down here. We operate in the world based on our model, and as far as we know, it works just fine until something fails, right? And Schenck calls this an expectation failure. And unless something fails, we're going to assume that our model is sufficient. So when that fails, then we're ready to learn. We're now ready to say, oh, something needs to be fixed here. I don't want this to happen. I want to be able to do it better next time. What do I need to do? And suddenly what we've just done is we have exposed an area in their model that's empty or insufficient. And the natural desire is to fill that up. Okay? And so just by doing that, we've now basically shown them why what they're going to do next is relevant, because it's going to fill in that gap in their model. So you start with what they know, which is what we've already talked about. Then using partly, one of the reasons we talked about what are their common misconceptions or mistakes and what are the consequences, you can use those to actually let students experience an expectation failure. So their model doesn't work. And then you can come in and demonstrate how what you're teaching them fixes their model of reality. Okay. Okay. I'll give you three examples. Thank you for the beautiful segue. These are actual examples on campus, okay? And by the way, I've also tied this to the different types of experience that we talked about earlier on. So Chemistry 105, general education course. People come there with all kinds of background, all kinds of expectations, all kinds of maybe low expectations. And there's one faculty on campus that does a very good job. And he does it completely by vicarious experience. First day of class, he comes in and he kind of taps the desk and he says, how do we know that this desk is made up of tiny little particles we can't even see that are mostly space? And students start giving him all the textbook answers, right? But he said, but look at this. I mean, this is solid. Where are they? How do we know? How do you know that this table is made up of these tiny little particles we can't even see and they're mostly space? And of course, they can't answer that question, okay? So actually, the easiest way to generate an expectation failure is to ask that kind of question, okay? A good question, right? And then for the next 2 weeks, he proceeds to go through and show how we have arrived at our current model of the atom, okay? And he does it in a very similar fashion. He starts with, clear back. I mean, he goes through it historically, but he's not just giving names and dates and their famous experiment, and so we know that therefore blah. No. He's doing the same thing. We have this model of chemistry, and lo and behold, something doesn't work. And another scientist comes along and says, well, why doesn't it work? Let's try this. So we try that, and here's an answer. And that answer works for a while, but lo and behold, that doesn't answer this question. Right? And so through this series of questions, he is leading students from one expectation failure basically to another to build this whole mental model and this whole rationale for the atomic theory of chemistry. And it works very, very well. And students, I mean, I've seen some of the comments, and I, for one, am not a person that likes to get up and go to class at 8 o'clock in the morning, but I've seen students saying, I enjoy coming to your class at 8 o'clock in the morning. And you could look at it, Socratic method, or even in a sense, the scientific method, right? Because we're always, here's a question, let's try and find an answer. We answer that question, and then it spawns more questions, and we just keep going, right? And even in drama and literature, that same thing applies, that same structure. Question and answer, leading us along. As we learn something, we have another question. We learn something else, we have another question, leading us along until we get to the dramatic climax where all questions are answered, right? Okay, second example. This is an example of a simulated experience. Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay. Statistics is not the most fun thing in the world. I'm sorry, right? For most students, statistics is just not the most fun thing. And for engineers, it's even worse. They want to be doing things, fixing things. So faculty member has a statistics class for engineers, and they come in and they don't really care about statistics. So he has this simulation that basically is a little simulation of any process that has multiple inputs. And he gives them this whole scenario of this company that's manufacturing something, and it's got these different inputs, and they have to manipulate these inputs to maximize the productivity, or maybe to minimize an error in production, okay? And then he says, okay, here you go. Go do it. You've got 30 tries to see if you can get the maximum. So, and he does this basically because he says, and it seems to be true, engineers just love to fiddle with things, right? So they just want to jump in and they want to start pushing knobs and basically trial and error. So that's what they do. They jump in and they start playing with all these things, and they have 30 tries. And at the end, they have to give him their answer. What do you think is the proper setting for this process to maximize production? Then he asks him the question, how do you know that this is the maximum? Are you confident that this is the maximum or the minimum, whatever it might be? And of course, they don't really know for sure. They don't really know. This was just as good as they got, right? And they can see that other students, other groups have gotten different answers than they did, right? So their trial and error doesn't work. And then he also tells them, by the way, you spend a lot of money for this company. Every time you did this, it costs money. So there's a real world reason now to minimize this fiddling around, right? Trying to get it right. So he says, would you appreciate knowing a process that could get you the maximum or the minimum in 8 tries? And of course they say, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to have that. That would really help me as an engineer. And so then he teaches them the statistical process for coming up with the settings, the optimum settings, right? But because they have failed at this, and he now shows them a way that they can improve their model, it's night and day for him. This used to be a struggle to get them to want to learn. Now it's completely the opposite. They're ready, they want to learn, they see the value, and they're asking good questions, they're very engaged. Another faculty member teaches mission preparation course on campus. And he basically the idea is, well, what are you going to do on your mission? Well, you're going to meet a lot of people that you don't know, and you're going to have to talk to a lot of people that you don't know. How comfortable are you talking to people that you don't know? And of course, most of them, well, not me, I just don't do it. I mean, weird people do that, not me, And so his assignment, a nice little direct experience, which lasts throughout the entire course, the entire semester, is you go meet X number of new people, right? And so basically, again, this is not the only thing he does, but this is one good example. They're actually out there. They can see, right? This is what I'm going to be doing if I go on a mission. I'm going to be meeting new people. And I have an opportunity now to learn how to do it before I get out there when I really am going to need it, when I ought to be good at it. And so this is obviously with all of these, people still have agency. Not everybody is going to jump up and shout hallelujah and run out and do things. But most of them do. Why? Because they can see how it's going to be relevant for them in what they have planned for their future. So there's just 3 really quick examples. Okay, so another one. Take a couple of minutes now. Think about what you're going to teach and start putting some things together and think about how can you help students experience an expectation failure. Whoops, I missed a line. And then also how you can either demonstrate or let them experience how what they are learning fills in that gap. Okay. There's actually, my colleagues know, I was sweating this presentation because there's a whole lot more that can be said about this. There's a lot of stuff that I haven't touched on, which I'd love to discuss with anybody anytime. But at least in terms of what we discussed, you can actually get quite a ways down the road if you answer these two rather blunt questions, right? Where does this fit? And why should I care? Those are, I think, subconscious questions that students are asking themselves as they're sitting in your class. How do I fit this in, what I already know, and what's it worth? You know, why should I care? And if you can remember those two questions and think about how do I answer those two questions, that'll take you quite a bit ways down the road.